bless you. Let's open our Bibles tonight to the book of Mark, chapter 1. Begin reading with verse 16. Mark, chapter 1, verse 16. Now, as he walked by the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon, which we know as Simon Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishers. And Jesus said unto them, Come ye after me, and I will make you to become fishers of men. And straightway they forsook their nets and followed him. And when he had gone a little farther thence, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, who also were in the ship, mending their nets. And straightway he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in his ship with the hired servants, and went after him. Father, we come again tonight. Lord, we feel so unable, unqualified, undeserving to even come before your presence. And yet you've told us and given us assurance that we can come boldly before the throne of grace, and that we can find mercy in time of need. Help us to cling to those promises. And may we come before you tonight with a heart desiring to speak your word, to edify your people, to educate your people. And may we all find it from your Spirit to honor and glorify Jesus Christ. For it's in his name we ask. Amen. Early in my ministry, even through my college years, a person was judged a good preacher or a bad preacher by how much they yelled, how much they spit when they were preaching, and how much sweat they generated. If you were preaching in the early days when I was first called, if you preached and your shirt was not wringing wet with sweat, you hadn't preached. Was your dad ever like that you remember? He grew up in a different circle. Over the years, I have changed. I don't think that a sermon is judged by how much perspiration you generate, nor is it how loud you yell, although I can get loud when I really want to. I don't like to do that nearly as much as I did. I'm still changing. I don't know if you all have noticed, but over the last 5 years or so, I'm trying to emphasize more teaching than simply preaching and yelling and screaming and hollering like I used to. I listen to a couple of preachers on the radio. Some I agree with more than others. Some I listen to just to see what they have to say. Some I listen to because they are very well known international preachers. I listen to one occasionally that I would not agree with on several things, but on many things: the plan of salvation, the sovereignty of God, God's sovereign election, God's sovereign grace. We would agree very, very much. And in all the times I've listened to him, I very seldom have ever heard him raise his voice. He teaches, and he's internationally known, but he teaches more kind of like talking to the people. And he's very effective. So tonight, I'm not going to yell and scream and holler and spit and all of those other things. I simply want to teach you some things, hopefully, and then apply those things to our individual lives. In thinking of John the Apostle, John is one of the better known apostles. He is one of the apostles that is mentioned as much or maybe more than Simon Peter. And we all know that Simon Peter was always the first one to speak. If there was anything going on, Simon Peter was always the first one to talk and say something. John the Apostle wrote 4 of the books in the New Testament. Anybody think they can, don't try it, but how many think you can name all 4 books that John wrote? 1. How about the Gospel of John, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John? They all have his name. He wrote more books in the New Testament than any other writer except the Apostle Paul. Paul wrote 14 books in the New Testament. John wrote 4, more than anyone else. He's known as one of the 3 innermost circles. There were the disciples, there were the apostles, then within the apostles, there was Peter, James, and John. Peter, James, and his brother John were the innermost circle. And within the inner circle, John was repeatedly known simply as the disciple whom Jesus loved. It's interesting, in the book of John, John never mentions his name. It's always son of Zebedee. It's the brother of James. And we'll get into that later on perhaps. The theme of every one of his books is love. He's been called the disciple of love. Particularly 1 John. You cannot read 1 John without coming away saying that throughout the whole book, John made it a special point to emphasize the importance of love, even in assuring us of our salvation. He wrote the Gospel of John to show that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, but that Jesus Christ was also God himself. According to history, John is the only apostle that died of natural causes. Every other apostle died a martyr's death. But what do we know about John personally? And we'll be going in the next week or so, we'll be looking at some of his accomplishments, some of the things he has stood for, some of the things that we can see some characteristics in his life. And there are several passages that will show us that though we're going to look at some things about him, he was still a very meek, humble person. I want to look at just a few things tonight by way of introduction. Who is John the Apostle? I'm going to try to help us see some of the things that molded John to become the man that he became. It's been said that many of us are smaller images of the way that we were raised. I've said this, but my wife tells me that I'm becoming more and more and more like my dad with every passing year. I'm not sure how she means it. I take it as a compliment. I was very proud of my father. I was very thankful to have a godly father. And so he become more, and many of you, if I were to start with you and go around and across, many of you are today what you were in being brought up. In Tennessee, we called it being reared. You know, you didn't raise kids, you reared them. That was the term, and it meant partially exactly what it said. You were often reared if you got out of line. But what do we know about John? What made John John? First of all, let me give you a little background. The first thing we see about John in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we see very similar examples of when Jesus called him. But all three of them agree that when God called him, he was a fisherman. I'm not talking about one of these guys that goes out on a boat, you know, with this speedboat, you know, gets out there, takes a rod and reel, puts a worm on it or whatever, throws it in the water, and then sits there and waits to catch something. I'm talking about commercial fishermen where they would take great big huge nets, throw them down into the water, and then the boat would move along, and the net would catch whatever happened to be in the way, and then they would begin pulling it up by hand. They didn't have cranes where you push a button and brings the net up full of fish. It had to be done by hand. We know Simon Peter on one occasion after the resurrection of Christ, if this is any indicator, they were out on the boat, Jesus was on the shore, and Jesus said, "Have you caught anything?" And they said, "We've toiled all night." And Jesus said, "Throw the net on the other side." And they caught so many fish that the ship began to sink. When they realized it was Jesus on the shore, Simon Peter dived into the water, swam to the shore, and then he went over and pulled the net in by himself, physically pulled the net into the shore, and it had 150 big, great, huge fish. Now, I'm told that a 10-pound fish is a pretty good sized fish. I don't do enough fishing to know, but I'm told that 10 pounds, so even if we cut that in half and say each of those fish was 5 pounds, that's still 750 pounds that Peter pulled into the shore. Am I right? 5 times 150. He's my mathematician. He literally pulled into shore against the water. He pulled in at least 750 pounds, pulled it in the shore. Being a fisherman was not a wimp's job. It was tough. Bringing those fish up, pulling those fish out of the water, pulling those nets up into the boat. It was hard work, and you had to be strong to do it. They had to rely strictly on sheer muscle. Now, thinking of myself, I might could pull 5 fish in at 5 pounds. I might could handle that. But being a fisherman means he had to be strong. He had to be tough. He had to work very hard to be a fisherman. Now, in verse 20, it seems that his dad owned the ship and the business that went with it. Ships were very expensive. Someone was telling me a few weeks ago that they were looking at a boat. And it's just one of those, what do you call them, pleasure boats, I guess. You know, one of those boats that you just go out in the water and let it sit there. That they were looking at just a plain boat, and it was around $50,000-$60,000. Picture a great big, huge fishing boat with all of the workings and all of the stuff. This would have been a very large boat, which if Zebedee owned it, that means he had to be well off financially to buy the ship. Then he had to be well off financially to hire the helpers to work on the ship. Or he had the best credit in his day, which they didn't have banks, so it would indicate that he probably was a wealthy man. And so John grew up in a hard-working, strenuous job, but he was also from a fairly well-to-do job. Now, I ran across a verse in the book of Luke, and I've read the Bible probably 150, 200 times, from Genesis to Revelation. I've read the book of Luke more than that, and I have never, ever saw this verse until this week. Let's see if you've caught it before. I never had until this week. Luke chapter 5 and verse 10. Notice what the Bible said. And so was also James and John, the sons of Zebedee, which were partners with Simon, or Simon Peter. Did anybody know that before just now? I've read Luke several hundreds of times and never caught those 3-4 little words. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, were partners with Simon Peter. That explained a lot to me why you find James and Peter together on so many different occasions. And then one day, they're out there on their boats, and they pulled those great big nets up, and we're not talking a cowboy rope that you throw and catch somebody. We're talking humongous nets, thick ropes, and they're pulled them up, got them up on the boat. Now they're going through piece by piece, and they're cleaning the nets for the next day's fishing. That's dirty work. Growing up, I never had to clean anything. All I would say is, Mom, the floor's dirty. Okay, son, and she'd come in and clean it for me. When I got married, I said, honey, we hadn't been married but a few weeks. I know I've told a few of you. She said, let's get one thing straight right now. I'm your wife, I'm not your mother. I will not be treated like your mother. Cured me. I've never done that in 51 plus years now. But it was dirty work. You know, you're out there, it's hot. You didn't have, the cream to put on with that SFP or whatever it is, 80, to keep you from sunburning. You were out there, it was hot, it was sunny. You often got tanned and burned, and you're out there cleaning out the little fishes that got stuck. You're having to clean all that. It was dirty work. So you had to be strong, but you had to be willing to get dirty as well. But here comes Jesus one day. And he stops over yonder and calls Simon Peter and Andrew and said, "Follow me." Then he walks down a few feet and he sees Peter and James cleaning the nets. And he said, "Follow me." Here's the part that I'll come back to in conclusion. They immediately followed. Well, he must have been unhappy with this job. You read that into Scripture because it's not there. You have to read it in. There was no indication that he was looking for a career change. There's no indication that he was unhappy with this job. But when Jesus called, he understood immediately that he must forsake everything and follow Jesus. And so he walked away, leaving his father and the servants, the hired hands, leaving them to clean, leaving them to take care of the business, leaving them to take care of the fishing and all of that, because God had called him for something higher than fishing for fish. Jesus said, "Follow me." And immediately Peter, James, and John left everything and followed him. I was reminded of what Jeremiah said. On one occasion, Jeremiah had been persecuted. He had been arrested. He had been thrown in jail. He had been thrown in a dungeon. He had been lied about. He had been mistreated. And so one day, Jeremiah said, "I quit. I've had it up to here. I'm done. I'm not preaching anymore. I'm not going to speak anymore in the name of God. I'm tired of being persecuted. I'm tired of being, everything." Jeremiah said, "I quit. I give up. I'm done. I've had it." Anybody that's ever been called to preach knows what I'm fixing to say. Jeremiah said, I quit. But there was a burning in his bones that he could not quit. Peter, wealthy family, his father owned a big ship, maybe even 2 or 3. Jesus called and Peter said, "Yes, sir." Remember what Jesus said in the book of Luke? "If any man come after me, hateth not his father and his mother and his wife and his children," and names over a whole bunch of things. If any man comes to me and is not willing to forsake everything behind him and follow me, he cannot be my disciple. He cannot be my disciple. So when Jesus said, John, follow me, John immediately followed. Well, what about your dad? I love you, Dad. I'll see ya. I must follow Christ. Well, what about your partners? I hate to desert them. I hate to lose my job. I mean, I've got a hard job, a dirty job, but it's a good paying job. But you see, God has called me to a higher calling, and I must follow Him. Now, there's some other interesting facts that I found about John. In Mark chapter 3, verse 17, Jesus, well, let's read it. Mark chapter 3, it should just be one page over. Mark chapter 3, and in verse 17. He's talking about that he is ordained 12 in verse 14. He has ordained the 12 apostles. And he begins to, say they shall have power, in verse 14, that he might send them forth to preach. He gave them power to heal the sick and to cast out demons. Simon, he surnamed Peter, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James, and he surnamed them Boanerges, which, if you have a reference Bible or a reference column, it probably says it means sons of thunder. Now, I read, 8 or 10 different commentaries just on that word thunder there. And everybody had well, not everybody, but there were all kinds of different ideas. Some think that it means they had a loud voice. I'm going to call you sons of thunder because you can talk and you can be heard without a microphone. You're loud. By the way, in my early years, nobody had microphones. If you wanted to be heard, you had to practice preaching from down here, and you had to speak loud enough that you could be heard in any auditorium, regardless of the number of people. I've often read Spurgeon, and he would preach on Sunday morning. He would preach to anywhere from 5 to 10,000 people in Metropolitan Tabernacle. And I've often wondered, I still wonder, how he did it without microphones. And yet nobody in any part of the building had any trouble hearing him. When we were in Australia, we went to the famous Opera House. Of course, as we were going through, they were telling us all these things about it and, its history and how it was built. And the Opera House was built so that you could stand on the stage and just talk normal. And it was so built, the acoustics, that just talking normal, you could be heard all over the building, pretty much. They were sons of thunder. They were loud. Some think Jesus gave them the name because in Luke chapter 9, when Jesus was going to Samaria, and the Samaritans said, "We don't want you. Your face is set to Jerusalem. We don't want you to come unless you're going to come and stay a while, and you're going to Jerusalem." So they did not want Jesus coming to their city. John is one of the ones that said, Lord, you want us to call down thunder and lightning and destroy them? Some think that's where they got the name thunder, a little premature. Sometimes thunder was used to instill fear. Remember when Moses was down in Egypt, one of the first miracles that he called thunder and fire down from heaven? Thunder was to intimidate and scare the Egyptians. In 1 Samuel chapter 7, the Philistines are attacking Israel, and God sent mighty thunder to discomfit and scare the Philistines away from Israel. In Job chapter 40, Job talks about the thunder of God's power, comparing God's power to that loud burst of thunder. Revelation chapter 6 tells us that one of the seven angels who opened one of the seven seals, and when he opened the seal, there was a noise of thunder as God was about to pour wrath upon the earth. Sometimes thunder was used to show God's disapproval. In 1 Samuel chapter 12, Israel has demanded a king. Samuel has told them, you don't want a king. God is your king. And Israel said, we want a king. And so God granted it. And the day that they anointed their king, God sent thunder and rain to show his disapproval on what they had done. In Psalms 104, the writer talks about the waters of the flood of Noah. It says that they literally, the waters of Noah's flood fled from the thunder of God's voice. On the road to Damascus, when God speaks to Saul of Tarsus, the men heard it as thunder from heaven. So they were called sons of thunder. To instill fear, they certainly did. When they preached, when Peter preached, there in the book of Acts, when he got through preaching, the people trembled and said, sirs, what must we do? His message put fear into the people. We also know that John was the brother of James. I told you that. But did you know it was the same James that was killed by King Herod in the book of Acts? So in the book of Acts, John, who is one of the apostles, one of the three inner apostles, the only apostle that is called the innermost, the apostle that Jesus loved, lost his brother under the dictatorship of Herod. That's when Herod killed James, arrested Peter, and intended to kill Peter the next morning. It was the same John whose brother was killed. Matthew chapter 20. And I can see a lot of mothers doing this. What mother wouldn't want to take care of her kids? In Matthew chapter 20, the mother of James and John, the wife of Zebedee, went to Jesus and said, Lord, I have a favor to ask. Jesus said, what is your request? She said, Lord, I want James and John, I want one of them to sit on the right hand of your throne, and I want the other one to sit on the left side of your throne when you sit in your kingdom. And of course, John had to rebuke her. And then he turned to James and John and said, are you ready? Are you willing? Are you able to endure what I'm fixing to endure? And they both said, oh, yeah, yes, Lord, we can be baptized with the baptism that you're about to be baptized with, not in the Jordan River, but the baptism of torture, the baptism of pain, the baptism of crucifixion. Yeah, Lord, we can do that. And Jesus had to rebuke them. Now, in many ways, we still have John today. John's been dead for about 2,000 years, give or take. But there are people that still live on, like John. He was a hard-working man. And I know a lot of people that are hard-working. They work hard from sun-up to sundown. They're not lazy by any means. And thankfully, they make enough money that they can pay for everybody else that doesn't want to work. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't America great? But there are people that God has blessed to be able to own a fishing vessel, and for your dad to own, and not only that, but your dad hires other people. Thank God for hard-working men and women. But when Jesus called, he was willing to forsake everything. I've covered that, but I want to emphasize it. He walked away from who knows how much money his family was worth. He was willing to walk away from his family, from his friends, he was willing to walk away from a steady income. I'm arguing with myself. I'm going to see which side wins here. How many of us would quit our job completely with no promise of an income, no promise of support, no promise of anything, to go to a foreign field and become a missionary on a foreign field, or even in America, because God clearly, specifically, absolutely called them? This wasn't, a mama saying, son, I think you would make an excellent preacher. It wasn't that. This was a definite, absolute, firm call from Jesus himself. Follow me. And he walked away from everything and followed him. I know of two men in my lifetime that have done that. One of them was Dempsey Henderson. You all, if you were here back in the early to mid-90s, you might remember he came to our church up in the old building. He was a missionary to Brazil. God called him to Brazil as a missionary. He got on a plane, flew to Brazil with nothing but $25 a month support. Well, Dempsey, you need to spend a couple of years, raising support. No, God didn't call me to raise support. God called me to Brazil. I'm going to Brazil. He got on a plane, went to Brazil, and then God began to raise churches that supported him. Dempsey was only, he was he was kind of like Zacchaeus. He was a wee little man. But he said, God called me to the mission field. God didn't tell me to spend 2 or 3 years and I have to have a guarantee of so much money before I'll go. God called, I'm going. And the money came later. His wife got sick and had to go to the hospital. They were back here in the States, down in one of the hospitals there in the Paducah area. And they went in and they said, can we see your insurance card? He said, I don't have one. Well, then we need the money up front before we can take your wife as a patient. I know laws have changed. He said, what do you estimate the bill to be? They said, well, estimates are your bill will be somewhere around $20,000. This was way, 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 way back. Probably be $300,000 or $400,000 now. And they said, we have to have the money before we can treat your wife. He said, the day she's discharged, I'll have the money. He went home, began praying. Without saying anything, people said, hey, we heard your wife's in the hospital. We want to give 100. We want to give. And the day she was discharged, he sat down, wrote a check for $22,000 and paid the hospital bill in full. The other man that I know, which we support, Brother Paul Brown Sr., pastoring a very large church in Oklahoma. He was 63, 64, 65, somewhere in that range. Had a good church, very well off church. Took very good care of him as pastor. And he got up one day and said, God has called me to Turkey. I'm sorry, Thailand. Well, you know, you're going to spend at least 3 or 4 years. No, I'm not. He spent a very short time visiting churches, presenting his work, got on a plane and flew to Thailand. And I've talked to him many times since. He lives in conditions that many of us would not even think about living in. Gave up a very good church, good house, because God said, follow me. Follow me. Another one, Brother Matthew Valandry, that we also support. He was a pharmacist making 6+ figures. He was making somewhere around $200,000 a year as a pharmacist. God called him to Thailand. He quit his job, spent a short time on deputation, and went to Thailand, where he is today. Peter said, God called me, and I'm going. Well, how you going to live? That's God's going to have to provide. I don't know. This time you're still going to be fishing. But you're going to be fishing for men. Now, we read that, and without understanding the background and the context, we miss one of the very important lessons that Jesus was telling Peter or John. He told Peter too, but that Jesus told John, you know how hard it is to fish for fish? You know all the work, you know the labor, you know everything that goes into fishing for fish. You're still going to be fishing. But now you're going to be fishing for men. Oh, that means I get to wear a suit every day. I get to drive around in an air-conditioned car. And no, Peter. Fishing is hard work. Whether you're fishing for fish or whether you're fishing for men, it can get very hard sometimes. It can be work. Remember what Paul wrote, if any man desired the office of a bishop, he desireth a good. What's that next word? Raise your hand if you know. What's the next word? He desireth a good work. Being a soul winner is work. Maybe not physically. Maybe not, pulling up 750 pounds of fish in a net. But Peter, I don't want you to have any false illusions about this. It's going to be work. It's going to be hard sometimes. But I want you to think about fishing and all the work that's involved. You're still going to have to work. But now the prize is the souls of men. Little did John ever imagine how his life was fixing to change. He had no clue that he would have to go through many of the things that he went through. He had no clue that he would be cast out on an island all by himself for no other reason than preaching the gospel. He didn't know any of that. But he knew Jesus said, "Follow me." And he followed Jesus. And we'll get into some other things that John did because he followed Jesus.